Truly, I did not think that most of what we saw in the week 1 PTS iteration of subclassing would go live, but here we are. Season of the Worm Cult has been released in a brave new world of endgame raiding. Nobody truly knows what's meta, nobody truly knows what the best combo is fight to fight, and nobody knows what to run. Until now. I've spent weeks testing and theory crafting until my brain exploded just so I could pick the pieces up off the ground, put them back into my head, and continue working. And after tons of testing and research, I've come up with what I believe is a phenomenal starting point for our new meta raid comp in update 46. And this video is going to make you one of the first to know exactly how to navigate the brave new world of subclassed raiding. But before we start, I want to take a brief moment to explain the purpose of this video. Danger in making a 12-man raid comp video is that a player might look at this and assume that this is the best and only way to run a 12-man raid team in 2025. Now, I cannot stress enough, optimizing raid comps in ESO is extremely complex, as many of you are about to discover, and I cannot possibly make a video that will tell you what the absolute best comp for each and every fight in the game is, because especially with subclassing, this is just going to change dramatically from encounter to encounter. I mean, especially in the score pushing sense. For example, what we might run on the very first trash pack is very likely not going to be what's best to run on the second or third trash pack. It truly can get that specific. Now, what this video will do though is give you the best starting point that you've ever had. So we'll start by discussing how we'll tackle pen, crit damage, and then all of our important buffs and debuffs. With this comp being built with maybe the lowest skill gap we've ever seen in order to maintain all of these important buffs, and then I'll talk about how we can make things a bit more complicated for the upper echelon of players that will truly only squeak out a tad more damage potential. After this, we'll break down my suggested setups for the tanks, healers, buff DDs, and Parse DDs with graphics linked in the Discord and soon on the website for easy access to all of this information, with the goal of this video being to explain the why as opposed to simply laying out the what. Start by looking at the what. The comp at face value. I have one tank in Zoran, Pearl, and Crypt Cannon, and the other tank in Turning Tide, Lucent Echoes, and Spalder or Archdruid. If you need more Vuln or simply don't want to run Spalder on the tank for the sake of safety, run Arch. However, Spalder will be a bit more optimal. The current DD meta uses skill trees that provide enough passive crit damage for us to drop sacks when we combine Herald of the Tome, Assassination, and Adric Spear. And the meta will always include Herald of the Tome and Assassination, but if you aren't running Adric Spear, we can simply slot Fighting Finesse or Backstabber to make up for the difference. However, if more than 4 DDs end up running Fighting Finesse, it will be more optimal to drop Lucent Echoes and FF and simply add sack seals into the comp for major force. Now, it will be far easier for younger raid teams to simply slot Fighting Finesse, Lucent Echoes, and call it a day, because sacks requires a solid ult rotation and really strong group coordination to min-max its value. Likewise, another interesting option for tanks this patch to use over Zoran is a classic. Yolnahkrin will make a bit of a return for groups who want to use the heroism affects on their banner. Xena's got nerfed, so it's no longer a reliable source of minor courage, which means that courage is unquestionably the most optimally sourced through banner, though this is going to require groups to run heroism potions, which are still for some reason ungodly expensive. So you could still do heroism banner with tripods and then simply replace Zoran with Yoln, since Zoran is such a marginally small DPS increase anyway. I mean, truly, it's very, very small, so this is a totally viable option in my opinion. For healers, I have one in SPC, Pillager, Ozezin, and then you can run Pearls as well here, but with the nerf to Pearls, we can get the same buff by slotting Trample, and then we can double bar SPC for better uptimes. The other healer I have in MA, PA, Naz, Pearls. The situation with Pearls in general is a little strange. You either take Pearls or Trample as a healer, and when running a set like SPC that needs to be reapplied every 4 seconds, there is an argument for having the set available on both bars. But with MA, PA, we only need MA to be accessible on our main ultimate, which is usually on our back bar, and then PA only needs to be active on the bar that has echoing slotted, so we can front bar back bar the set and then gain access to a monster in Mythic. This allows us to get a free skill slot by just using Pearls for major heroism, though the workload to maintain major heroism does have a pretty high skill gap. If we were to say move Zoran to the healer though, we would for sure drop Pearls so that we can body Zoran, and frankly, if you want an easier life, just drop Pearls in general and throw on one trainee plus trample. So 3 potential support combos depending on what you'd like to do this patch. Combo 1, incorporating Lucent Echoes and Fighting Finesse to hit the crit cap, with the tank setups using Zoran, Pearl, Crypt, and then TT, Lucent, and Spalder or Arch. and then the healers running SPC Pillager Ozezin and MAPA Naz Pearls. If you do need to run Sax though, the comp would shift to Zoran Pearl Crypt and Sax instead of Lucent plus TT and Spalder or Arch on the tanks, and then SPC Pillager Ozezin and MAPA Naz Pearls on the healers. Alternatively, you could just drop Crypt Cannon and then move Zoran to the healer in place of MA and then run both sets of Sax on the tank if you'd like. Any of these options will work fine, but I did list them in order of damage preference. Finally, if you want Heroism Banner, the tanks should run Yolm, Pearl, Crypt, and TT, Lucent Echoes, Spalder, and Arch, and then the healers should run SPC Pillager Ozezin in Zoran PA Naz, dropping Pearls for Trample, and placing War Machine on an additional DD. For our damage dealers, we will have 2 to 3 buff DDs this patch, with only 1 true buff DD that isn't using Fate Carver. Now that true buff DD will either be in Zenkosh or Zen Onsel, the VMA Greatsword, the Velothi Urmage's Amulet, and One Piece Slime or Valken. The other buff DDs have near full parse setups, running War Machine, Deadly, Velothi, VMA Greatsword, or Inferno in a One Piece monster. We'll put the Elemental Knife on either the Zen DD as they're spammable, or far more preferably on the Beam buff DD in place of Cloak. We'll look at these setups in depth a bit later. This just kind of depends on the group goals though. You'll notice that we choose to drop MK altogether this patch, and as it stands, the weight damage has skyrocketed in unprecedented levels. The damage that you'd lose by either making a Beam DD or non-Beam DD good for MK uptimes, or the damage that you'd lose by putting a Beam DD in MK seems not worth the damage gain from the set. However, if this does change, you'll likely see MK pop up on a Beam damage dealer, but not one already running a buff set. If we pair 2 buff sets, we will only ever pair Alkosh and Zen, since Alkosh is actually a pretty decent DPS set, but doing, say, MK War Machine would nuke one player's damage at a level that's far higher than the damage the group would gain from running that set combination. And for that reason, it's simply never worth it to pair 2 buff sets in that capacity. Finally, our Parse DDs are looking to most likely pair Onsel with Deadly, Velothi, the VMA Greatsword, or Inferno in a One Piece monster. Now, to better understand this setup and to understand how subclassing has affected each of these builds, I think we first need to dive into the why of the comp, the real bulk of the video. So when I go to build a raid comp, I have this sort of pre-made template that first lists all of the players' sets and then their bar setups, and then a section that I use to check buffs. You'll see that from this outline, penetration, and crit damage have their own separate spaces, followed by a general buff and debuff section. This is because hitting the pen and crit damage caps in your raid comp is by far the most important part, so let's start there. We are looking for the easiest and most consistent way to hit the 18,200 pen cap. The DDs should naturally have some pen already in their toolkit, especially with the new subclassing meta almost certainly using the Herald of the Tome tree. Splintered Secrets got a buff, which makes this passive now worth 2,480 pen when simply running Flail and Beam, and every DD having this passive makes the pen equation much easier. DDs also should have the Piercing passive from our champion points, worth 700. The Velothi Urmage's Amulet is still meta, worth another 1650, so damage dealers should be able to provide at least 4,800 pen for themselves. Now we go to our super basic sources of pen provided by the support. Major Breach, which is worth 5948, Minor Breach worth 2974, and the Crusher enchants on an infused two-handed weapon worth 2108, and those incredibly standard debuffs leave us with only 2.3k pen left to account for. Now normally, especially because in the past some DDs were not Arcanists, we would rely on Alkosh to make up for the roughly 4 to 6k pen DDs we're typically missing. But since everyone can have Herald of the Tome now, we get to make a choice. The increased cost of Fate Carver has made Coral Riptide a set that is far more difficult to maintain, maybe even more difficult than it's worth outside of a few short encounters. So groups have actually moved towards Perfected Onsel's Torment as a new meta option, partially for the line of penetration it gives, worth 1487. This then leaves only 853 pen left to account for, which we can make up for by running one light armor piece worth 939 thanks to our concentration passive. So basically, just by running what's already meta, all we would need is Major Breach, Minor Breach, and Crusher, with the DDs running one light armor piece and having a one piece line of pen somewhere in this build. Keep in mind, especially with the Slimecraw nerf, running a light Valken is totally a valid option again if you don't want to use Hansel. This will very easily put us at 18,200 pen for bosses, but remember, Crusher can only affect one target at a time, and it does take some finesse to control in multi-target encounters. encounters, so if we can't rely on Crusher, we can simply slot Alkosh and ignore the 1 light and 1 line of pen that DDs would need. On PC, I imagine it will be common to include Alkosh in Trash to hit pen cap for this reason, but PC teams can likely take this set off for bosses. On console though, I think running Alkosh all the way through a trial is just going to be the most worthwhile optimization for the vast majority of players. Now our next most important stat, critical damage, is usually the biggest pain point in a raid comp. It's what an entire ult rotation is usually planned around. However, the new DD meta encompasses at minimum Herald of the Tome and Assassination, giving us access to the Fated Fortune and Hemorrhage passives. Fated Fortune gives us 12% crit damage whenever we generate or consume a crux, which we will constantly and easily be doing, and Hemorrhage gives us another 10% with no proc condition. So we get 50% crit damage at base, 12% through Fated Fortune, 10% through Hemorrhage, at least 12% by running 6 pieces of medium armor thanks to our Dexterity passive, and 10% through Minor Force, which we source most consistently with the Velothir Mage's Amulet. This already brings us up to 94% critical damage, and the way that we get to 125% is where some small complexity and actual player performance can come into play. Without a doubt, the most difficult source of force to maintain is Major Force, most commonly kept up through combining the set Saxiels as well as other players alternating the Warhorn ultimate. Keeping good up times with Major Force historically requires a ton of coordination, planning, and skill, but this is no longer necessary in Update 46. Instead, we can use Minor Brittle, which we will easily maintain with the charged Ice Staff plus Winter's Revenge to give us this debuff in an AoE radius, Loosen Echoes for another 11%, and then by having the DDs slot either Fighting Finesse or Backstabber worth another 8 or 10% respectively. Fighting Finesse will put us at 123% crit damage, which is just fine, and Backstabber, when we can maintain it, will put us at the full 125. And on top of that, if we can hit pen cap without running any light armor, we can also just run 7 medium, and then Fighting Finesse will put us at 125 even. I think that this will be the easiest one-size-fits-all type of solution. However, there is an emerging meta solution to this problem with subclassing. One of the strongest third tree options right now is Adric's Spear, mostly for the Burning Light passive, and this tree also gives us access to the passive Piercing Spear, which gives us another 10% crit damage, removing the need to run Fighting Finesse or Backstabber altogether. Now, this might not seem like a huge deal, but as a general rule of thumb in score pushing scenarios that require 3 or 4 support, it currently is more optimal to double up on sets like EC and Loosen Echoes when 3 to 4 of your DDs have to run Fighting Finesse, and this is most commonly seen in Crow-dominated comps currently, so that they can get rid of that swattable for Wrathful Strikes. Pairing Loosen Echoes in EC is stronger than DD slotting Fighting Finesse and gaining access to a full set like Zoran, so removing Fighting Finesse is really an optimization choice that is a significant DPS increase when you can play around it. As we'll discuss in more detail later, I think it will be beneficial to have 3 or 4 DDs run the Daedric Summoning Tree in super well-coordinated groups, which means that they would have to run Fighting Finesse. If this is the case, and again, if your group is well-coordinated anyway, integrating a Major Force ult rotation with Sax will be a little bit more overall damage than Loosen Echoes plus Fighting, and that assumes that your Major Force up times are strong. That's a lot of information. If this sounds confusing, don't worry. We're going to recap the entire comp with far less words at the end of the video, and there are graphics provided that you can look at to help as well in Discord and soon to be on the website that should answer a lot of these if-then scenario type questions. With pen and crit damage out of the way, we now get to address our very long list of essential damage buffs and debuffs and decide where they're coming from. As a general rule of thumb, just because there is a source of something doesn't necessarily mean that it's worth using, and the word to think about here is efficiency. We always want to find a source that is easy to use, easy to maintain, and easy to integrate, and these terms change build to build. We also love 2-for-1 skills like Boneyard that give both Major Breach and Minor Vuln, and do so in an AoE radius. It's a no-brainer. Easily top 5 skills in the game for raid comps. So with that in mind, let's talk about where I think our best sources of all of our important buffs come from, and then the next section will outline who should be running this by discussing more in-depth builds for each role. Let's start with the penetration buffs and debuffs. Major Breach is obviously best sourced through Boneyard, so you'll have a tank or healer take the Gravelord tree. Minor Breach is a little tricky, but the most efficient source is Ice Wall, since this will apply Minor Breach to chilled enemies, and as long as Brittle is being maintained well, Wall will be reliable for that. If you're worried though, you can run something like Deep Fissure or a scribed skill like Soul Burst for AoE Minor Breach if you'd prefer as well. Our last pen debuff, Crusher. I have the tanks in my raid comps run Ice Staffs infused with Crusher enchants, since Crusher targets the closest enemy to you as you cast your weapon ability, which is usually wall, and the tanks are always the closest to the priority target, so it's pretty guaranteed that Crusher will proc correctly. For crit damage, the only debuff we need to source is Minor Brittle, and this is by far best done with Winter's Revenge from the Winter's Embrace tree on the Warden, which will most likely be run by a tank. If you pair Winter's Revenge with a charged Ice Staff, you will have perfect uptimes with Minor Brittle, and you'll get those uptimes in an AoE radius. It's seriously just a no-brainer. This will require at least one tank to run a double Ice Staff setup though, so that they can do a charged Ice Staff with Winter's Revenge on the front bar and an infused Ice Staff with Crusher on the back bar. For our long list of miscellaneous buffs and debuffs, here I just have a list of all of the important major and minor buffs and debuffs in the game and where I'm going to source them this patch. Major Vuln we can source in a few ways, most likely through the set Turning Tide, with the downtime from the set either being filled by a set like Archdruid or with the Vuln being extended from a set like Naz on another one of the supports. Now there are a fair amount of fights where you can't really maintain good uptimes with TT though, so in these situations you'll want at least one support running the Colossus ult, with likely the Pillager healer running Naz to extend the duration, and maybe Arch if you find some gaps in uptimes. Minor Vuln is simply sourced in an AoE radius with Boneyard, which we already have slotted for Major Breach. Major Courage we will source through the set Spell Power Cure on a healer, and Minor Courage is a tad ambiguous. By far the most optimal source this next patch is going to be Banner Bear's Affix script. However, I know a lot of people like to use Banner for Minor Heroism, so as an alternative, we do have the set space to bring back a classic. You can run Yolnahkrin on the tank if you opt for the Lucent Echoes plus Fighting Finesse route to hit the crit cap, and this comp truly will work fine for any trifecta. Now, it's technically not the most optimal, but making the choice to be more optimal is not necessary in Update 46 and fully based on group preference. Our next buffs, I'll pair the major and minor weapon and spell damage and the major and minor weapon and spell crit buffs, since we only need one source of each of these pairs thanks to the hybridization changes years ago. Major sorcery and brutality we source through igneous weapons, which means a support will need the Earthen Heart tree. Then we need either minor sorcery or minor brutality, and we get minor brutality naturally through the Earthen Heart tree's Mountain Blessing passive, which just requires us to hit an Earthen Heart ability once every 20 seconds. You'll be able to do this through Stone Fist or Igneous Shields, or I guess even Igneous Weapons every 20 seconds if you really want to. I mean, there are a lot of ways to proc this passive. For our weapon and spell crit buffs, DDs are largely on their own with Major Prophecy and Savagery. We will have to rely on Camo Hunter for this buff. The only exception to this is the buff DD who can run Flames of Oblivion. There are some combinations that we'll discuss a little bit later that can run Prophecy and Savagery on the banner, but then that would require Yolnahkrin and Heroism pots, so it is a bit of a tough optimization, but it's one that definitely exists and that a lot of high-end groups will potentially use. Then we only need one of those two buffs for their minor iteration, again thanks to hybridization, and that iteration is Minor Savagery, which we can get from the Hemorrhage passive in the Assassination tree. This passive simply procs whenever a player does critical damage, which is super easy because everybody's going to be running this tree. Next, Minor Heroism we talked a little bit about already, but to reiterate, this is best sourced through potions, but since they are so expensive and with the death of Xenas, if you choose to get Minor Heroism through Banner, you'll have to use the set Yolnahkrin on a tank, which we can actually make room for this patch. Our recovery buffs, Major Intellect, Endurance, and Fortitude, we will solely rely on potions for. Every class this patch can run Tri or Heroism pots for these buffs, but the minors are a bit trickier. Xenos was our best source of those, but with it now only affecting 6 players, we don't have a super easy and reliable source of Minor Intellect, Endurance, and Fortitude. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of sources. We should very naturally have access to Enchanted Growth from Green Balance, Refreshing Path from Siphon, or Radiant Aura from Restoring Light as a part of the meta healer skill trees this patch, but they just aren't as reliable as Xena's, so in my comps, I probably will forego this buff altogether in Update 46. If you do really want it though, you can use one of the skills I just mentioned on a healer and see which provides you with the best uptimes. Major and Minor Slayer won't change. The only note that I'll add is that Rojo is very dead. I mean, it has already been for a while. Even in Update 45, you can accidentally get better Slayer uptimes by utilizing War Machine and Master Architect, as opposed to even a really strong player who can maintain Rojo very well, and this even applies to newer groups. Drop Rojo from your comp in Update 46 and slot 2 players in a Slayer set. War Machine for the damage dealers or Master Architect if you're putting it on a healer. We'll touch more on this a bit later. Minor Slayer, all of the DDs can only get from running a trial set like Onsol or Riptide. Our last name, Major and Minor. Minor Berserk will continue to be slotted via the healer's Combat Prayer or the DD's Camo Hunter very naturally. For Major Berserk, we actually might be able to get really strong uptimes this patch as well. Now, this concept is a little advanced, but in my trifecta comps, I will likely likely have 4 of the DDs run Daedric Summoning with the Storm Atro over Languid Eye. This will cost 170 ult in our Herald of the Tome, Assassination, Daedric Summoning setup, and with simple math, we can see that our base ult gen plus minor heroism should be able to give us a Storm Atro every 37 to 38 seconds without factoring in sets like Pillager or Crypt Cannon. Daedra Berserk lasts for 10 seconds, so that means that you need 4 Storm Atros on a rotation for perfect uptimes, and you may even be able to get away with 3 depending on how well you can work the Pillager and Crypt Cannon timings into the equation. This will be very difficult though. The Parse setup, which we'll discuss later, is hard to optimize, and the Berserk rotation will be very tough to track and maintain. So if you don't want to worry about that, just have 1, maybe 2 DDs or even a support run the Storm Atro so that you have some sort of source of major Berserk. For our unnamed damage buffs, starting with Stonefist, whichever support is running Igneous Weapons should also run Stonefist, both for the strong buff and the Mountain's Blessing passive. I think that this will most optimally be done on a tank, but you can slot this on a healer instead if you really would like to. Scribed ability Throwing Knife is still important, but with the nerf to Azure, the Martial Knife is the least important that it's ever been, so you really only need to make sure that you have the Elemental Knife, those scripts being Multi-Target, Assassin's Misery, and the Prophecy and Savagery or Off Balance script. This will likely be slotted on the Fate Carver DD over Cloak if you're running Off Balance, or over Camo Hunter more ideally if you're doing Prophecy Savagery. You're really not going to get great Off Balance uptimes very easily by slotting this on a Beam Arc in my opinion, so for bosses, I think defaulting back to the Elisus plus Lightning Wall way of proccing Off Balance will be better, and in AoE demanding fights or trash pulls, you can have 1 DD with the multi-target Off Balance knife ready to run for AoE fights, and a different DD ready with the Prophecy Savagery knife for single target fights, and just have them switch off. If you're going for simple though, having 1 DD with Off Balance knife and using Lightning Wall plus Elisus for Off Balance will likely result in the best uptimes with the least amount of effort for this essential buff. As a note, this wasn't an issue in update 45 because we just had buff crows or sorks use the Off Balance knife as a spammable, so the uptime was always naturally good. The buff DD in update 46 though doesn't really have room for this ability in my opinion, because they need to build and consume Crux with the spammable Rune Blades and then the skill Tentacular Dread. Then we will want to make sure that we have at least 1 damage orb for the Combustion synergy, by far the strongest synergy in the game in terms of damage for your group. This will go on the buff DD, but is admittedly a bit hard to min-max when healing orbs are in groups, so you can drop this skill if the buff DD needs bar space or can't sustain it. Another skill, Engulfing Flames, is the least important that it's ever been, but we need it for Zen anyway, so any flame damage from flame walls or maybe even the occasional Destros will get buffed by this ability. Last main skill to discuss, Banner Bearer. In this comp, the conversation for scripts on Banner Bearer is a bit ambiguous. Direct damage, magic damage, and AoE damage are all near identical sources for total DPS output between 12 players in a raid this patch. I mean, truly, you won't notice a difference between any of these 3 for the focus script. Now, for most situations, I'll probably end up choosing magic, but then again, the argument for AoE could be made for Azure as well, and even Flail. So, I mean, this is just going to be so close, nobody's going to notice a difference, I promise. A quick note, since I said the forbidden word, I'm fairly confident Azure will still be worth running on 1 DD in Azure fights, and don't stress the nerf. The damage that we gain from this patch far outweighs that fight specific damage nerf. So in my opinion, the best scripts for Banner, we choose AoE, Magic, or Shock for the focus script, Class Mastery for the signature, and Courage or Prophecy and Savagery for the affects as meta options, but Heroism I guess if you do want it. If you do choose Heroism though, it will be suboptimal, and you will either need Yolnahkrin in the comp, or you'll need support sweating out skills like Soul Burst for Courage instead, and the uptimes on these skills really are not good, they're not reliable. In regards to Prophecy and Savagery, this is hard to understand without looking at the DD bar setups, so I'll reserve this discussion for a little later on in the video. With all of our important damage-oriented skills, buffs, and debuffs out of the way, let's go over the main survivability-oriented buffs and debuffs that we should have as well. Adding in mitigation buffs is always super helpful for trifecta and hard mode progs, but we think about them secondarily because pushing damage to meet certain burns, or skip certain mechanics, or to even make rough mechanics last for a shorter period of time will always be the best way to handle content, no ifs, ands, or buts. We then integrate these mitigation buffs where we can without losing any damage to make fights as safe as possible. So there are 3 categories of these buffs in my head. The non-negotiable mit buffs that must be in the comp, the lesser important ones that are pretty easy to source and then can be in the comp, and then the most unrealistic buffs to source that we only go for if a fight really benefits from that specific buff. Let's break it down. The non-negotiable must-haves to me are Major Resolve, Minor Toughness, and Minor Evasion. Group-wide Major Resolve comes from the skill Frost Cloak in the Warden's Winter's Embrace tree, which is a more tank-oriented skill line that a tank will likely already choose to gain access to Winter's Revenge, so that player must run Frost Cloak as well. Minor Toughness comes from the Warden's Green Balance tree from the passive Maturation, which activates whenever a target is healed. Finally, Major Evasion comes from Cloak, and the DDs usually run this skill as a part of the damage meta anyway. If you do have to drop a front bar ability, try to make Cloak the last resort, but it is still technically a flex skill, and players just need to be aware that they're going to take a bit more damage in general without Cloak slotted. Minor Evasion though comes from the Arcanist's tank tree Soldier of Apocrypha through the passive Circumvented Fate, so you'll likely have a tank take this tree for that passive as well. This second category encompasses buffs that are relatively easy to source and make a pretty big difference in group survivability, so you really should include them whenever you can. The easiest is Weakening. You usually have the tanks run infused Ice Staffs with Crusher, and then the healers run infused Lightning Staffs with Weakening to help proc off balance with the Lightning Staff, and then to increase the potency of our Weakening enchant with the infused trait on a two-handed weapon. After that, Major Cowardice and Major Maims are nearly must-haves. Major Cowardice is the easiest to source from the tank's Wield Soul, our go-to chain, choosing the Cowardice Affix script. However, you can get an AoE source of this through the tank's Bone Tyrant ability, Agony Totem. This AoE is very small and therefore not super reliable in my opinion, but it is an option nonetheless. AoE Major Maim is best sourced through Shield Throw. Having one tank run a Sword and Shield for this ability will usually be worth it. Otherwise, you can use Frost Clench instead on the tank as their primary taunt if you only have one or two main targets who need the debuff, though Inner Fire provides a very strong damage synergy and is therefore far more preferable in my opinion. Maybe this is just from the perspective of an advanced group, maybe in newer groups people really aren't taking synergies so it doesn't matter that much, just make the best decision for your group. Minor Cowardice isn't really a super important buff, but if a healer does have the bar space, they will both have access to Power Extraction in the Siphoning tree, which can provide Minor Cowardice. Then the only other skill to really seek slotting onto support ideally is Warding Contingency. This ability only hits 6 players at a time, so good uptimes are best achieved by running this ability on 2 players. We typically opt for the Shield Focus script, the Gladiator's Tenacity Signature script, and the Protection Affix script, which will give us 8% damage reduction through Gladiator's Tenacity and another 5% through Minor Protection. It's one of those 2-for-1 abilities that we talked about earlier. Now, a lot of other secondary MIP buffs and debuffs that exist in the game we get fairly naturally. Minor Maim comes from Chilled, which means if Winter's Revenge is keeping good Brittle, it's also keeping good Minor Maim. Minor Resolve is kept up naturally through the healer's primary spammable combat prayer, though admittedly somewhat unreliably. Finally, our last secondary buff, Minor Vitality, is kept up pretty well with the go-to healer monster, Ozezin. This leaves our final category of MIP buffs, the ones that are hard to source and therefore rarely worth using. We only source these buffs when a fight really benefits from them. One of those buffs is Major Protection, and there are a lot of individual skills that can give this buff to an individual player, but few that can give the buff group-wide. The most notable skill being the Arcanist's Glyphic of the Tides. This will give Major Protection to everybody for 15 seconds, which makes it a good ult to hold onto for big damage-intensive phases, like Maelstrom on Teleria or Shrapnel on Ysela hard mode. This comes from the Arcanist's Curative Rune Forms tree, which you'll likely put on a healer if a raid calls for this buff. The other tough-to-source buff is Major Vitality, and this really only comes from either Bone Surge or Soul Siphon. This buff increases our healing received and damage shield strength, making it very good for big heal checks, like the one seen from the second boss in the new trial Ossian Cage. Bone Surge, though, must be slotted on 2 people, and then people must be stacked close enough to benefit from somebody taking the synergy, making it very tough to use. But Soul Siphon is an ult with a pretty small range, but it's not that small, and it's far more reliable. The trade-off is just, a skill versus an ultimate. But make the decision best for your group here if you do feel the need to include Major Vitality. Now that we know where everything is coming from, let's briefly recap this comp by looking at each player's setup, keeping this new subclassing system in mind. And we'll start with the tanks. And while a few small things have changed, the builds in terms of skills at least mostly remain the same. From the support, we will need to source the Winter's Embrace, Earthen Heart, Gravelord, Soldier of Apocrypha, and Siphoning trees for all of our buffs and debuffs. Now, this is only 5 of the 12 total trees that we get to pick for all 4 of our support. So as long as these buffs are accounted for, the best thing that support can build into, in my opinion, is ult gen, and this makes the Bone Tyrant a solid base for tanks and the Siphoning tree a solid base for healers. I have both tanks running Bone Tyrant mainly for necrotic potency, and we also gain access to the powerful heal Scythe. Then the non-crypt tank should run the Gravelord tree so that they can switch between horns and colos as needed, while the crypt tank will likely be vamp draining to try to get off 500 crypt cannons as often as possible. For this reason, we should also assume that the crypt cannon tank will be the off tank. Now, I really don't like the term main and off tank because of the way that they're used in recent times and recent content, so for the sake of this video, our main tank will be doing the role that takes the most damage, even if that means not tanking the boss, and the off tank will be doing the role that takes the lesser amount of damage, even if that does mean tanking the boss. Now, however, one weird caveat, if the crypt tank is going to be vamp draining, the other tank should probably be stone fisting. This means that we'll give Earthen Heart to the main tank, which just leaves Winter's Revenge and Soldier of Apocrypha for the off tank. So for our main tank's build, this player will be in Turning Tide, Lucent Echoes or Sex, and Spalder or Arch, depending on all the factors that we discussed earlier, as well as the Bone Tyrant, Earthen Heart, and Gravelord trees, with the front bar looking something like Stone Fist for the buff, Necrotic Potency for the damage reduction and ult gen, Scythe as a heal, Igneous Shields for both survivability and sustain, and then Shield Throw with the multi-target Druid's Resurgent and Major Maim scripts, mainly for AoE Major Maim. Though you can make this a single target taunt or even run Clench if you'd like. Then we'd slot either Temporal Guard or Barrier on the front bar, depending on if we would prefer more damage mid or mag sustain. On the back bar, we'll run an Infused Ice Staff with Wall of Elements for the Crusher enchant, Minor Maim when Shield is procced, and Minor Breach when Shield is procced. Then Igneous Weapons as an essential buff skill, Scribed Chains with the Pull, Druid's Resurgence, and Major Cowardice scripts, mainly for Major Cowardice, Inner Rage as our main taunt for the massive damage synergy, and then Unnerving Boneyard for Major Breach and Minor Vuln. Now, if the other tank can source Cowardice, Chains will more or less be our flex slot. We need to be able to run Rapids in Trash, and if the other tank can source Chains, then we can use Rapids here, or that tank can run Rapids instead, where they have a little bit more bar space than we do in this setup. And in boss fights where we don't need Rapids, we can use Contingency here instead, with the Shield, Gladiator's Tenacity, and Protection scripts for bosses. As a note, this is about as in-depth with these builds as I'll get into. I'll reserve more detailed information for each and every one of these specific builds that we're discussing for their own video coming soon in the future. Now, the other tank will run Pearlescent Ward, Zoran or Yolnahkrin, and Crypt Cannon, potentially dropping Crypt and running Sax instead of Zoran or Yoln if you want to double Sax on tanks. This tank will run the Bone Tyrant, Winter's Revenge, and Soldier of Apocrypha trees, with a front bar that might look something like Potency for the Mit and ult gen, Scythe as a heal, Impervious Rune Ward as our big shield, Vamp Drain to big build Crypt Cannons faster, and Winter's Revenge for AoE Minor Brittle with a charged Ice Staff on the front bar to keep good uptimes with Minor Brittle. Our back bar would contain an Infused Ice Staff for our Crusher enchant with Wall of Elements, and Wall will also proc Minor Breach and Maim through Chilled as well. Inner Rage as our primary taunt for its strong synergy, and we'll run Contingency with the Shield, Gladiator's Tenacity, and Protection scripts for the Gladiators and Minor Protection buffs, and we should use Contingency in bosses and flex this for Rapids and Trash pulls. Then we'll run Frostcloak for group-wide Major Resolve, wield Soul Chains with the Pull, Druid's Resurgence, and Cowardice scripts as another flex slot, but as our primary chain when needed that also will give Major Cowardice. Parade is not very damage intensive on us though. We could replace Soldier of Apocrypha for Siphoning on this build instead, just losing Minor Evasion, but gaining access to the Catalyst passive, which will speed up our ult gen for Crypt Cannon dramatically. For our healers though, Siphoning is just going to be a must-have for the sake of ult gen and the general healing passives in this tree. We'll need one healer in Green Balance for Minor Toughness and one healer in Restoring Light for Ritual and its Purify synergy. Luckily, all 3 of these trees combine to make a very strong healer build, so we can do one of a couple of things. Both healers are running ult sets, so we can divide these responsibilities to give both healers access to Necrotic Potency in the Bone Tyrant tree, which isn't a bad play. We could also move MA off the healer altogether, let the Pillager healer run ult gen trees, and then have the PA healer use Siphoning, Daedric Summoning, and Intricate Rune Forms to create the 12-second barrier build showcased in my healer PTS video. Frankly, this is probably what I'll be doing for a lot of my groups progressing trifectas in the future, but get creative here and do what works best for you and your group. For min-maxing damage though, you'll likely have the SPC Pillager Naz Healer take Siphoning, Green Balance, and Bone Tyrant with a front bar of Springs, Combat Prayer, Seeds, Healthy Offering, Regen, and Soul Siphon, and then a back bar of Necrotic Potency for the ult gen, Lightning Wall for off balance, which should also be infused with a weakening enchant, Trample for major heroism, Healing Orb, Echoing Vigor, and then Barrier or Warhorn. Remember, you do want 2 Warhorns slotted between 3 support, ideally to rotate once every 30 seconds if possible. Then the MAPA Naz Pearls Healer could take Siphon, Bone Tyrant, and Restoring Light, flexing Bone Tyrant for the Curative Rune Forms tree if you want major protection through Glyphic on certain fights, with a bar setup that might look something like Springs, Combat Prayer, Healthy Offering, Regen, Echoing Vigor for PA on the front bar, and then Soul Siphon, and then a back bar of Altar, Lightning Wall, Orb, Necrotic Potency, and then a flex slot, and then Barrier or Horn. If you were to do the 12-second barrier build, keep in mind we wouldn't have room for potentates, but with Pillager Crypt, it should still be very close to 12 seconds. And to do this, we would take Siphoning, Daedric Summoning, and Curative Rune Forms with a front bar of Springs, Regen, Combat Prayer, Healthy Offering, Echoing Vigor, and Soul Siphon, and then a back bar of Evolving Rune Men to build Crux and proc Curative Rune Forms passives, Wall, Bound Aegis for the max mag, Orb, and Altar with Barrier as the ult. Finally, for our DDs, our buff DD should take the Herald of the Tome and Assassination trees like any other, but then should take Ardent Flame to get access to strong Zen dots, as well as passives that allow Burning and Poison to act as reliable Zen dots as well. This means we'll have to slot Fighting Finesse if the group does not have Sax, and then we will have to pair Zen with Onsel and run a light Slime Craw when we don't have Alkosh. Finally, we will choose the VMA Greatsword for single target fights and the VMA Inferno for AoE oriented fights. This makes the build Zen plus Alkosh or Onsel, Velothi, the VMA Greatsword or Inferno, and one piece of a monster depending on our pen needs. Suggested front bar would include Merciless Resolve, Writhing Rune Blades as our primary spammable, Tentacular Dread to consume Crux, and using these 2 skills will proc Fated Fortune to make sure that we are a crit cap, which only won't be necessary if we have Sax and Lucent Echoes, and this will be rare. Only if this is the case can we run Surprise Attack or Elemental Knife in place of Rune Blades as a spammable. Our next skill will be Impale, then Claw as a Zen dot that will also proc Poison more often, with Incap on our front bar ult for the Assassination passives. Our back bar will include either Wall or Stampede depending on the arena weapon we choose, Engulfing Flames for the Zen dot and burning up times, Mystic Orb, Barbed Trap as our third Zen dot, Flames of Oblivion for our weapon and spell crit chance buffs, and Languid Eye or Standard as our primary ult. And which ult is stronger will need tested in content. To recap our Zen dots that are reliable in this build, Claw, Engulfing, Trap, Burning, and Poison should get us to that 5% value, and Burning and Poison truly are reliable. And there is an Elemental Knifing group, Charged Daggers that have Flame and Poison enchants, our Herald of the Tome passive that increases our chance to apply status effects further, and then skills that proc those status effects more often through Claw and Engulfing. We even get a 6th free dot though when we run Alkosh, since this sets damage over time proc does count towards Zen as well. Finally, our Beam DDs. The meta for these players will be Riptide if you can sustain it, but more realistically, Onsel paired with Deadly, the Velothi Mage's Amulet, the VMA Greatsword for single target, or the VMA Inferno for AoE fights, and one piece of either Slime Craw or Valken depending on pen needs. Now, our bar setup gets a little funky depending on what we're doing, so let's use this as a baseline. Front bar, Camo Hunter, Cloak, Fate Carver, Flail, Banner with Magic Focus, Class Mastery Signature, Encourage Affects, and then Incap as this front bar ult. Then on the back bar, we'll run Relentless Focus for the passive weapon and spell damage, Ball or Stampede depending on the arena weapon type, Scholarship, Fulminating Rune, Banner, and Languid Eye as our primary ult. Now for the War Machine Beam DD, they'll simply slot War Machine over the Trial set and run Elemental and or Martial Knife if needed over Cloak on the front bar, likely with the Aedric Spear tree as their third choice for the strong passive. Though we won't have room on the front bar for an Aedric Spear ability, so we will have to slot Fighting Finesse without Sax. The Parse DDs, on the other hand, should run Aedric Spear and replace Cloak with Blazing Spear, rarely if ever actually casting this skill, but just slotted for the 10% crit damage. This does get rid of Major Evasion though, which makes this choice a little dangerous, so if you don't want to have to worry about the 10% crit damage, we can choose whichever other tree and then slot Fighting Finesse, or we can make up for the lack of crit damage by running Sax. Now, this concept in particular, I think, is the main reason that Sax will still be the most quote-unquote optimal comp decision, but I maintain Lucent Echoes plus even Fighting Finesse will be far more consistent for the vast majority of players, even though it's a small DPS loss. As a final thought though, if you don't want to do any of this and you really want to keep Cloak for major evasion, you could drop Camo Hunter, run the Prophecy and Savagery banner, and then replace Zoran with Yolnakrin on the tanks to get minor courage. This is another valid approach, and truly, whatever works best will really just depend on the group. As one final optimization, I mentioned briefly during the video that I'd probably be rotating some DDs with the Storm Atro ult. These DDs would have to run Fighting Finesse if there was not Saxon group as well, and their bar setup would drop Cloak on the front bar and Fulminating on the back bar for the Twilight Tormentor, and we would also drop Languid on the back bar for the Storm Atro. Now, this is a damage loss, around 5 to 7k single target in fact. I managed to hit about 157k with the Parse Dummy iteration of this setup, as opposed to 165k in Adric Spear or Dawn's Wrath. However, this 5k loss per player is well worth the gain if Major Berserk is actually maintained well. Even if we assume this Sork type player loses 10k DPS, we have a buff DD who gains say 7k, Sork beam DDs who gain 10 to 14k, and then full Parse DDs who gain 15 to 16k per player by maintaining Major Berserk. This is obviously worthwhile, but again, quite advanced, tough to maintain, and unnecessary if you don't want to. I tried quite a few bar setups to min-max my damage with Daedric Summoning, including combinations of Daedric Prey, Haunting Curse, and the Tormentor, but the Tormentor replacing Cloak and Fulminating and that being the only real change produced the best results. And as I said earlier, these are just super generic outlooks on each of these builds that will create a solid starting point for you. Subclassing has opened up so many ways that we can make small tweaks to each of these builds to achieve nuanced results. And to truly understand these things though, we have to dig deeper. And that's why I am hard at work with tons of build videos lined up and on the way to help you master your role and your build in this brand new landscape of subclassing. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you can be among the first to wrap your head around the way that this game has changed overnight.